Good afternoon, everyone. Breaking news, Spain 2, England 1. But it's okay. Someday they'll win. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. Here in the auditorium and online. We have a lot of people online, I understand. I'm Richard Rand, Associate Director of Collections at the Getty Museum. And it's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Joelle Wickens. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the land Getty inhabits today was once known as Tavangar, the home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people, as well as all First People, past, present, and future, and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. Getty commits to building relationships with the Gabrielino Tongva community. We invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us in caring for it. I also have a few practical notes, as always, to share before we begin. For guests here in the lecture hall, please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. For our online invitees, attendees, closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on the Zoom menu bar at the bottom of the screen. And time permitting, I think we'll have time, we will be able to take your questions at the end of the talk. For our online audience, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom menu bar. And for those here in person with us, there'll be a colleague with a microphone. Please wait and speak into the microphone so we can all hear you and people online can hear your question. All right, great. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon to hear from Dr. Joelle Wickens. Her lecture, Proactive, Holistic, and Sustainable, Preserving Collections in an Uncertain Future, is the first in a series of talks planned here at the Getty for the next year or two. I'd like to thank the Getty Museum's Conservators Forum, particularly Sarah Freeman and Madeline Corona, who have organized a wonderful program focusing on preventive conservation and how museums care for collections. These are, of course, key responsibilities of art museums, of course, including the Getty, as we seek always to engage audiences with works of art as broadly and openly as possible to provide access while preserving our collections for future generations. Now we must add to those responsibilities our increasing obligation to practice our profession and operate our museums as sustainably as possible. No one, I dare say, is better qualified to introduce us to these important matters than Dr. Joelle Wickens, who is Assistant Professor of Preventive Conservation in the University of Delaware Department of Art Conservation and the Interim Director of the Winter Tour University of Delaware Program in Art Conservation. And I know we have quite a few alum of that program in the audience today. Former students, thank you. I think we have a whole bunch of them here at the Getty, so thank you for providing us with such wonderful colleagues. Dr. Wickens holds a PhD and an MA with distinction from the Textile Conservation Center, University of Southampton in the UK, and a BA in American Civilization from the University of Pennsylvania. She will provide a stimulating overview of this specialized field and the essential role of preventive conservation in the preservation of cultural heritage. Her work brings social justice to the forefront of art conservation and preservation, which aims to redefine cultural heritage as many things to many people in a rapidly changing world. Her work in the field of preventive conservation, her topic today, is dedicated to placing at its core social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And with that, I ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Wickens to the stage.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and even more for the invite to come talk about a topic that I find interesting and useful and forward-thinking. I recognize that some of you out there have very little knowledge of what preventive conservation is, and others of you know quite a lot. I think I've crafted this talk so that when we are done 45 minutes from now, Those of you who are currently unfamiliar with preventive conservation will understand at least the basics. And those of you who are already very familiar with preventive conservation will have learned some history of the field that you didn't know, as well as some current work and new directions. I'd like to set the stage with just a little bit more about who I am. I find bringing my whole self to all that I do is best practice for me. What I do professionally is absolutely influenced by who I am personally, and vice versa. So let me give you just a little bit more context about who I am. As Richard already shared, I'm an assistant professor of preventive conservation at the University of Delaware and the interim director of the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation, commonly known as WoodPAC. In this capacity, I teach preventive conservation. Here I am in a storage space at Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library with Melissa King, a 2020 graduate of our program. Winterthur is the museum where our program is based. In addition to teaching, I study the practice of conservation, looking for ways that I can grow, evolve, and continue to be relevant in society today and in the future. You see the titles of a few of my recent talks and publications on the screen. And I direct an amazing graduate program that has been in existence for 50 years. In this role, I have the incredible pleasure of working with students and faculty to find a combination of rigor, practicality, and productivity that supports and is supported by individuals with multifaceted lives. Individuals who want and need to bring time and energy to all of those facets. Like the students and faculty I work with, I too live a multifaceted life. If I let them, each one of these facets adds rich layers to who I am as a professor, director, and conservator. Whether you see it in what I share with you today or not, some of the other roles I take on which have shaped how I work are that I am a wife, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a sister-in-law, a daughter-in-law, a friend, and a colleague to all of the folks that you see on the screen. I am also a person who loves to travel, explore the outdoors, knit, read, and I use a wheelchair to get around because multiple sclerosis has reduced my brain's ability to control my legs. And I am someone who understands I am incredibly privileged to speak to you today in a place that occupies the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielina Tongva peoples, and someone who understands I am part of a country that grew to what it is today on the backs of many people who had no choice in the matter. Finally, I'm the person who asked the Getty to publicize this talk with these words. I have promised to tell you about preventive conservation, how it is proactive, holistic, and sustainable, and how it is the best path to the preservation of collections in an uncertain world. It's kind of a big promise, but let's see what I can do. I'm going to start with proactive because I can't really explain preventive conservation to you without the word. At its very simplest, preventive conservation is making proactive choices to manage the environment around an object or collection in order to prolong the life of that object or collection. We see these proactive choices in our lives on a daily basis. We put our phones in cases in order to protect them from damage. We put all kinds of things in the cool temperatures of the refrigerator to slow down the inevitable process of mold growth and souring. We put sunglasses on our eyes and sunscreen on our skin to reduce the chance of damage from the sun. We make these very same choices as we care for museum objects. We put objects in cases to protect them from breakage. Here we see a 3-inch high hand-painted mother-of-pearl fan in a custom storage case. We use heating and air conditioning to maintain humidity and temperatures so objects won't grow mold and the inevitable chemical processes that cause deterioration will be slowed down. We put objects behind things that reduce their exposure to the harmful energy from a variety of light sources. Doing so extends the time before their damage from light is visible. These proactive choices to enclose things, control the relative humidity and temperature around them, and reduce their light exposure to light is preventive conservation. So, now let me tell you about two of the earliest and most amazing examples of preventive conservation I am aware of. They show what putting things in cases away from light and in controlled environments can do. I do not know that the choices made almost 20,000 years ago in one case and 1,500 years ago in another were proactive. So on this technicality, perhaps they are examples of involuntary preventive conservation. But no matter what, they are both fabulous examples of what preventive conservation can do. The first takes us across the Atlantic to what today is known as Lascaux, France. In 1940, a group of teenage boys made their way down into a cave and saw, for what we think was the first time in the 20th century, and perhaps the first time in 100 centuries or more, this painting and many more. They found a network of caves that was decorated by our ancestors some 20,000 years ago. Had these paintings been on the outside walls of the cave, exposed to rain, sun, falling debris, and other elements, they never would have survived. And perhaps there were many outside the caves that are indeed lost to time. But these are still with us because their case was protective and they were kept in a dark, stable environment. The second takes us south from where we are in LA to modern-day Peru and to the land of the Wari people. And funnily enough, to about the same time that those teenage boys were exploring the French landscape. In 1943, a group of farmers found 96 of these feather-covered weavings, which are on average 7 feet by 2.5 feet. They were found inside 8 of these jars, which are each 3 to 4 feet tall. The weavings date to about 600 and were at some point buried in these jars in a landscape that was fairly dry. Like the cave paintings, these weavings survived because someone placed them in a protective container away from light and in an appropriately controlled environment. This find is particularly amazing to me because of the macaw feathers the weavings are made from. Feathers are very vulnerable to damage from light and from bugs that like to eat them. However, a space in the dark that was uninhabitable to bugs and biological pests that might damage the weavings has delivered them to us today in an incredibly vibrant and intact state. And so, like I said, I'm not sure the choices made that resulted in these artworks still being with us today were proactive, but they do show what preventive conservation can do. So now, let's look at a little museum and conservation history to understand when and how this proactive decision-making was recognized as necessary by the museum field. It is a long and involved history, and our written knowledge of it is incomplete. For today, I'm going to introduce you to 3 distinct time periods: the earliest moments I know of, the period when our knowledge of preventive conservation took a huge leap in understanding and began the process of not only being proactive, but also holistic, and the time period when preventive practice became formalized and recognized as an essential part of the preservation of collections and museum conservation practice. Both of the earliest moments I know of took place in the 1800s. The first is not tied to a specific date, but rather more generally to an early part of the century. This is the time when many collections were moving out of the private realm and into the public. As this happened and the number of people allowed to interact with collections dramatically increased, the earlier practices of touching and smelling and physically interacting with collections were curtailed. Collections were put behind glass and other barriers, and patrons were taught to look, but not touch. The second is connected to a specific place and date, the National Gallery, London, in 1850. In this year, it is recorded that someone suggested that the paintings in the gallery be covered with glass on the front and tinfoil on the back. For those of you who know what a sealed package is, I wonder if this is the earliest reference to them. The reasoning behind this suggestion was that the glass and tinfoil would protect the paintings from the damaging effects of the heavily polluted London air. The gallery didn't take up the suggestion, nor did they take up the suggestion 3 years later to install air filtration. And then 8 years after that, they took a step away from physical preservation in favor of visitor comfort and opened the windows. These facts and much of the following history was published by my colleague Simon Lambert, and I am indebted to him for getting this information into the public realm. So, having marked a possible starting place for proactive decision-making in the museum environment, let's move to the 40-year period from 1915 to 1955. In this period, the understanding of preventive conservation takes a huge leap, and the practice of preventive begins to be not only proactive, but also holistic. For this, we initially move away from the National Gallery to another part of London and the British Museum and their decision-making during World War I. Their fear of losing the collection to bombing led them to move the collection out of the museum and into the tunnels of the London Underground. From what we've been talking about, this idea of a protective case better than the museum building and in the dark was a great idea. The problem was that the environment was too humid, and while the collection did survive the bombing, the humid conditions meant it arrived back at the museum after the war in a corroded and rusty and moldy state. To address the damage, the British Museum established its now long-standing research laboratory, and in 1924, Harold Plenderleith took on the role of department head. Plenderleith started researching and writing guidelines with respect to temperature, relative humidity, light, dust, biological attack, damage caused by the public, and the benefits of ongoing collection maintenance. In this, we get a hint that Plenderleith is thinking holistically, that each of these things is linked to the others. By the time World War II came around, Plenderleith knew that not only was underground storage necessary for physical protection, but also that the space needed to have its environment controlled to avoid biological and chemical damage. Both the British Museum and the National Gallery chose to move their collections to underground quarries outside of the city, where the conditions could be maintained at 60% relative humidity and 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the dark. When the collections were returned to their respective museums at the conclusion of the war, the items were undamaged, and the powers to be at both institutions are recorded as realizing that preventive conservation was well worth the expense and cost-effective. And, almost as if someone was trying to make sure the point really had been made, not long after the paintings were returned to the unconditioned spaces in the National Gallery, the paintings began to crack and flake. By 1950, air conditioning was being installed in the rooms where the objects were present. Perhaps you've noticed that our examples so far, where preventive conservation has been working, have had things stored underground in dark spaces with a relative humidity of 60% or lower. Our last example in this time period, where the understanding of and practice of preventive were becoming more holistic, brings us to the US in the early 1950s, and for the most part, above ground. As I indicated at the start of my talk, the Winterthur University of Delaware Program in Art Conservation has been located at Winterthur since 1974. It is where my office has been since 2008. Winterthur is home to an absolutely amazing collection of American decorative art. Over 90,000 objects are on display in 175 rooms or in storage in another 120 places. The collection was amassed by Henry Francis DuPont, and in the early 1950s, DuPont invited Plenderleith to come from the British Museum to Winterthur to evaluate his house and collection and give him guidance on what he could do to better care for it. Plenderleith suggested to DuPont that one of the best things he could do for his collection is to install air conditioning alongside the heat that was already there. Doing so would allow him to mitigate the impact of the hot, humid summers in Delaware on the collection. In the 1960s, DuPont acted on this advice, and here you see the area in the front of the main entrance of the house completely excavated for the process. The installation involved not only the addition of the necessary mechanical equipment, but also the addition of storm windows on all of the windows in the house. These storm windows went in with dark gray glass rather than clear. The glass was recommended because it would cut down on the heat gain experienced by the house and therefore tax the HVAC system less. Here you see the same facade of the house we just saw, but this time with the landscaping was restored and the windows are in place. The overall result was a bit like moving a cave above ground. On the inside, the house was a more consistent temperature and relative humidity throughout the year, and it was much darker. So, by 1955, we have at least one important person in the museum world, Plenderleith, holding up the need to be proactive and holistic. This brings us to the final time period of this part of the story, 1990 to 2010, when proactive and holistic preventive conservation becomes recognized as an essential part of the preservation of collections. By 1995, the Canadian Conservation Institute had taken the list that Plenderleith had begun and categorized that list into the 10 agents of deterioration. They are fire, water, light, pests, thieves and vandals, incorrect temperature, incorrect relative humidity, physical forces, pollutants, and dissociation. With those of you who are new to the concepts of preventive conservation in mind, I'm going to pause from the history lesson for a moment and walk you through the agents and a bit of the damage that each one of them causes. Some of them are pretty straightforward and really need very little explanation, like fire. Fire destroys whole buildings or single objects and can turn things to a pile of ash or char only a part. Water can wash away entire buildings, cause the image on a photo to bleed, and soak a portion of something in a way that as it dries, the soiling in the wet portion migrates to a boundary where it concentrates and forms what we call a tide line. Whether something is graffitied, slashed, or stolen, we are all familiar with what thieves and vandals can do. Some of the agents, like light, might need a little bit more explanation. We're all pretty familiar with the damage it can do to our skin, but what can it do to objects? It can yellow them, like the hanger at the top of the image, which was exposed to sunlight, while the other was kept in the dark. We also see yellowing in the varnish on this painting. The varnish has been removed on the right-hand side, which makes the yellowing even more obvious. Light can cause colorants in objects to fade, like the stain on the wooden box and the outside edges of the tabletop, which were not covered with the smaller box during exposure to light. Light can also change color, which is what we see here. The bright and the dull portions of this fabric are of the very same piece of fabric. The bright piece was kept in the dark for the entire 40 years that the dull piece was in use as an upholstery fabric in a chair in a sunny room. Pests, which may be more accurately labeled biodeterioration, are again something we are all probably somewhat familiar with because of the mold that grows on our food and the insects that eat it. Mold can also grow on books and dusty surfaces, textiles, and other organic objects. Insects also eat paper and wool and fur and wood. We also categorize rodents as pests because they destroy a wide variety of objects to make nests. And lichen, as you see here growing on the outdoor sculpture, is also categorized as a pest. Pollutants may be a little less obvious because they are generally unseen. The chemicals, acetic acid, hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, and more, can cause the following kinds of damage. Silver tarnish comes from the interaction between silver and hydrogen sulfide. Wool fabric and rubber gaskets are good sources of sulfur, which are often found in the museum environment. A cardboard box, a wooden case, and certain kinds of foam will give off acids as they age. These acids will cause corrosion on metals, yellowing on paper and textiles, and Bind's disease in shells. There are also pollutants in our air from the burning of fossil fuels, which produce acid deposition, which damage outdoor collections. The next two need their names defined a bit. First, physical forces. The name of this one might not make sense immediately, but if I tell you physical forces can be further defined with the words impact, shock, vibration, pressure, and abrasion, then I think what physical forces are becomes quite clear. The force of an earthquake can cause things to topple and break. Bumping a person as they walk by a painting can push a shoulder into it and cause a tear. Not removing a watch or other jewelry before picking up an object can result in a scratch on that object. Packing an object in an inadequate box can result in pressure that crushes. Dissociation is the separation from an object of the information that distinguishes it from any other object. A corroded nail that came from a specific location in a specific archaeological site that has been connected with a specific century and a specific civilization may hold great value. Take that same nail, throw it in a modern garbage dump, separating it from all the knowledge of its previous existence, and it holds almost no value at all. Objects can be separated from their information in many ways. Pests eat writing off labels. Accession numbers can be erased or obscured. A computer system crashes and there's no backup. And storage can be so disorganized an object cannot be found so that it can be reconnected with the information we have about it. The final two, incorrect temperature and incorrect relative humidity, are particular in their wording. We cannot get rid of temperature and humidity. They are always there at some value. Generally, there are certain temperatures and relative humidities that are beneficial to objects and others that cause harm. Those that cause harm are the agents of deterioration. So, a temperature that is too high may cause an adhesive to soften and the object to fall apart. A temperature that is too cold may cause a pipe to burst or a painting to freeze and delamination to occur. A temperature that stays high for an extended period of time will increase rates of chemical reaction, causing objects to age more quickly. It is much the same way with incorrect relative humidity. A relative humidity that is too high will cause mold to grow or metal to corrode. One that is too low will cause desiccation and cracking, like we see in this piece of wood. One that fluctuates too much will eventually cause warping and cracking, as we see in these two pieces made from tortoise and ivory. So, that's a look at our 10 agents of deterioration and a quick look at the damage that can come from them. I've talked you through them as separate agents, but actually, none of them operate independently. They all work together in complex, holistic systems. We don't just have fire if we have a room in a museum on fire. We bring water to that fire to put it out. The fire also brings pollutants, smoke and soot, and the fire may burn the surface of the object, obscuring the accession number and thus bringing dissociation. Firefighters may bring damaging physical forces as they put out the fire, and the destruction of the fire itself brings physical forces. Fire and water definitely bring incorrect RH and temperature, and the chaos and destruction that results from the fire, physical forces, and dissociation can leave a convenient opening for thieves to do their thing. We could play this game of system building for days. If we have a metal object that gets dusty, it doesn't look that great. If it's in storage, that might not seem like that much of a problem. But if we layer on an incorrect relative humidity that is too high, the dust will absorb that moisture, hold it close to the metal, and the metal will begin to eventually corrode. The dust and moisture will also attract pests, and those pests may then eat objects or labels which cause dissociation. And if the dust was on books rather than on metal, and we add an elevated temperature, we will get mold growth. For another example, we could start with light and a light-sensitive object. That light may come from a heat-producing source, which could bring incorrect temperature, which can then lead to incorrect relative humidity. Maybe we address the light by putting the object in a box, but we choose an acidic box, which will bring pollutants that may accelerate the degradation of the object inside. It's also likely to attract pests in the form of silverfish, which like to eat the adhesive in these boxes. So now our challenge is bigger than 10 individual agents of deterioration. We are dealing with complex systems that are working to damage our collections, and we know our best bet is to take a holistic approach to address them. So now back to the history lesson. At the same time that these agents were taking their place in our understanding of how objects deteriorate, there were two other frameworks that were being developed that contributed to our understanding of how the agents work together holistically and how our proactive choices with respect to each of them can help them work together in a positive way. Those frameworks are conservation assessments and risk assessments. Conservation assessments largely originate here at the Getty Conservation Institute. They involve a conservator, an architect, and the museum staff of whatever institution and collection are being assessed. Together, they analyze the conditions of the building and collection and the factors that cause the good or bad conditions that exist. They then prioritize which factors to address first, second, third, and so on, and they put together a plan to improve the overall conditions for the collection. The GCI formalized conservation assessments for the first time in 1999 in this report that you see on the screen. And they have developed into a standard part of conservation practice throughout the country. The other framework, risk assessments, are often used in combination with conservation assessments. Risk assessments are a concept that existed in many fields years prior to its introduction to cultural heritage preservation. I imagine if you work in the insurance industry, the military, or the credit card industry, you are very familiar with the concept of risk assessments. Robert Waller was one of the primary people in the 1990 to 2010 time period who was developing ideas about how to prioritize next steps once something like a conservation assessment was carried out. The solution was risk assessments, where once the risks are identified, you systematically analyze the likelihood of each of those risks occurring and how much damage each one would cause. Then you can start addressing the risks with the ones that get you the most bang for your buck. And so, the agents of deterioration, conservation assessments, and risk assessments combined give us proactive and holistic ways to care for collections. Simultaneously with their development, the term preventive conservation enters the codes of ethics and guidelines for practice of many of our national and international conservation organizations. In these documents, preventive conservation is identified as the primary objective and the essential responsibility of conservation professionals, as well as of critical importance to the care of collections and the most effective approach to their preservation. In 1994, in Ottawa, Ontario, the conference Preventive Conservation, Practice, Theory, and Research took place. This was the first worldwide conservation conference ever held on the topic of preventive. The fact that such a conference was held seems to confirm that the museum world was accepting that preventive conservation was essential to their operation. And thanks to the study of another colleague, Fokia Boersma, carried out in 2016, we know that 8.5% of the conservation jobs advertised in the English-speaking world during this time period were preventive focused. When I shared this statistic with my husband, his response was, "That doesn't seem like enough." While I totally agree with him that it isn't enough and we need many more preventive conservation positions, I do think that this 1990 to 2010 time period, the statistic is confirmation that preventive conservation has been recognized as essential. And so, by 2010, we have a proactive, holistic field of preventive conservation. And for our time together today, we have one more word to go: sustainable. To bring in sustainability, we'll start with some sections of the J. Paul Getty Museum collection policy. We could do this next step with the mission statement and/or collection policy of almost any museum. But since we're here at the Getty, it seems to make sense to use theirs. First, Care of Collections, Section 9. The museum shall conserve works of art in accordance with the highest standards. The museum shall provide a safe, stable, and appropriate environment for collections with effective security and environmental control for the benefit of present and future generations. If we ignore this one word, present, for now, then we know what to do. We've learned that putting things in a dark, stable environment protected from bombs works to keep things stable for a few years during World War II, for 1,500 years in Peru, or for 20,000 years in France. We could create this dark space for the Getty collection in 21st century fashion. It could be climate controlled, fireproof, sealed to keep pests out. The air could be highly filtered to all but eliminate dust and constantly extract airborne pollutants, and it could have a security system that even James Bond couldn't break into. If the goal of preventive conservation is to slow the deterioration of objects, to keep them around for as long as possible, and the goal of the Getty is to conserve works of art in accordance with the highest standard for future generations, this could totally work. However, if we return to that one word we ignored, and we look at some other sections of the collection policy, we find that the Getty Museum's purpose is to promote a civil society, to foster a greater appreciation and understanding of art, and that the primary means for the Getty to fulfill this mission is the exhibition of its own and borrowed collections. Considering this, the plan to lock the collections away in the ultimate storage facility fails the Getty in at least two ways. First, imagine the money and natural resources it would take to build and maintain such a space. I know the Getty name is often equated with endless piles of money, but I can't imagine getting a museum board to approve a budget for a space like that. And I understand the Trust has recently hired a sustainability officer. You don't do that if you're not at least at some level committed to managing your use of natural resources and impact on climate change. Again, I can't imagine this energy and resource-intensive conservation plan to store objects in a dark, highly controlled space would support the Getty's sustainability goals. But also, and equally, if not more important, how do you promote a civil society, foster an appreciation for art, and exhibit your collection if it's all locked away? The issue of preservation versus access is a long-standing one in museums. Do we save for future generations or make collections available for current generations? We know that by making proactive and holistic choices, we can physically preserve collections for future generations. If we layer on sustainability and practice sustainable preventive conservation, we can preserve collections in a way that prioritizes the environment, our local, national, and worldwide economies, and the people living and ideally thriving in these spaces. We can use collections today to promote civil society. We can care for collections today in a way that supports local economies and contributes to climate recovery. And we can preserve collections for future generations. We may have to accept that doing so will mean that collections won't last quite as long. We might have to shave a few years, or a few decades, or even a couple of centuries off their hypothetical lifetimes. But doesn't it make sense to prioritize positive impact today over a hope that collections will last far into the future, in a world where the future and what the people in it might want to do with the preserved collections is uncertain? With my last few minutes, I'll briefly introduce you to 3 projects that are developing tools and approaches that, if adopted, can bring sustainable preventive conservation into every museum. There are many, many to choose from. I've intentionally selected projects so that you can get a glimpse into how sustainable preventive conservation can have a positive impact on each of these 3 areas. Let's start with one that centers heavily on planet and profit. We have seen many times in this talk that a cool, not too humid environment is a pretty surefire way to protect most objects from damage. However, the ways we've developed to create and maintain these environments are natural resource heavy and expensive. To give you a little perspective on this one, I reached out to some colleagues at Environment and Culture Partners for some statistics. They came back with those that you see on the screen. There are over 33,000 museums in the US. If the entire sector reduced their energy production by 50%, the related reduction in greenhouse gas emissions would be equivalent to taking 452,000 passenger vehicles off the road. This number is more cars than all the registered vehicles in the state of Maine. It would translate to $60 million in annual operational energy savings. Like all statistics, I'm sure there is a way to dig into them and raise questions, but even so, I imagine you get my point. Museums are using lots of energy and producing lots of greenhouse gases. If we can find ways to collectively reduce energy use, we can make a huge impact. We have conservators, conservation scientists, museum facilities managers, and HVAC engineers working together all over the world to learn more about how stable an environment really needs to be to protect a collection, as well as how that environment can be maintained in a climate-friendly way. One of the groups that is working on this is right here at the Getty. It is the Managing Collections Environment Initiative. There is another, Climate to Preserve, at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Belgium, and if you dig a bit on your own, you will find there are many more. If you want to learn more about one specific project that the Getty's Managing Collection Environments Initiative supported, you could start by reading the page Adaptive Climate Control Strategy on the National Gallery of Victoria's website. The gallery is located in Melbourne, Australia, and their website will introduce you to their work with the Getty, but also to many of the other efforts to make museums more climate friendly. There appear to be no statistics yet available for how many museums are actively working to reduce their energy use by modifying the environmental parameters they keep and the way they go about maintaining them, but I'm pretty sure we are far from 100% participation. Our next project also centers heavily on planet, and rather than profit, brings people into the picture. It connects to the fact that we have learned that preventive conservation takes great care to make sure objects don't get damaged by physical forces and pollutants during their lives in storage, transit, and display. However, as we've developed the protocols that help museums achieve this goal, we've leaned heavily on materials that have large carbon footprints, and we've set up timelines and workflows that don't even allow for the reuse of these high-impact materials. Here again, we have conservators and conservation scientists working, this time with exhibit preparators, materials suppliers, and more, to develop tools that will help us select materials for our work that are less damaging to the environment and to the health of people using the materials. There are some resources available to us right now. The top image is a screenshot of a website homepage you can explore today, Sustainability Tools in Cultural Heritage, a project seeking to develop multiple tools to help conservators, museum exhibits teams, registrars, crating specialists, and anyone working to store, transport, or display objects, lower their environmental impact. The bottom image is the cover of a book that is focused on helping conservators make sustainable choices with one particular category of materials. These projects are a great start, but in the same way that we have a long way to go with energy resource management, we also have a long way to go with material selection, use, and reuse. One of my idols in this area is Paul Spey, chief packer at the Brooklyn Museum. Paul took it upon himself to establish a practice of ordering as few new materials as he can each year. To achieve this, he collects and reuses materials earmarked for disposal when exhibition spaces at the museum are deinstalled and from crates that are no longer needed. Thanks to this work, it's been more than 15 years since he has had to purchase a piece of lumber. His work reminds me that if we choose to make things a priority, we can make a difference. And for the final example, a project titled Operation Clothes Moth, which connects to planet, profit, and people. The specific details of this one date back to 2017 and take us back across the Atlantic to the United Kingdom. In the UK, English Heritage is a charity responsible for the care of over 400 historic sites and 500,000 objects. The objects are housed in 113 historic houses, museums, and storage facilities. In order to protect these collections from the agent of deterioration pests, they carry out what we call an integrated pest management program. At English Heritage, one of the things this involves is insect pest monitoring using over 3,000 traps across 40 properties. One of the pests they are particularly worried about are clothes moths, as you see here on the screen. Between 2012 and 2016, there was an increase in the number caught in their traps from 1,142 to 2,469. This increase in moth activity was being reported elsewhere in the museum community, but also in the general public, and it was being suggested that the increase was the result of warmer temperatures due to climate change. The reason I see this situation as an example that connects to planet, profit, and people is that rather than staying quiet about this widespread increase in moth activity, they decided to use the work of their preventive conservators to connect to the public, increase awareness of English heritage and what they do, hopefully increase visitation, i.e. ticket sales, and try to gather some data that might be useful to those working on issues of climate change and increased pest activity. So in 2017, they carried out Operation Clothes Moth. English heritage conservators and conservation scientists worked with the public relations, marketing, and digital presence teams to design and promote a project that would distribute 5,000 clothes moths traps to visitors at 113 English heritage sites across the country, have those people install the traps in their homes for 3 months, and then report the results back to English Heritage through a form on the English Heritage website. A media campaign was timed with the spring opening of the properties. The campaign resulted in 19 radio interviews, including one on BBC World Service, 6 TV spots, and at least 6 printed media pieces, 4 of them in national newspapers. You can read the rest of the story in both of these places, but I share it with you today as a brilliant example of how museums can connect the work they do to current climate issues and use it to connect with and educate a public that might not be familiar with their institution, and perhaps getting those members of the public to visit for the first time. And so, let's bring this to a close. Before pulling things together for this talk, I knew that the practice of preventive conservation had been around since the first time a living being had made a proactive choice to keep something from being damaged. I knew that the world wars were a pivotal moment for its development in the museum realm, that the 1990s was a decade where the practice became formalized, that you've been able to specialize in the practice of preventive conservation in the UK for much longer than you've been able to do so in the US, that you've been able to minor in preventive conservation at Woodpeck since 2002, and that we graduated our first major in 2020. And that there were strong programs and strong advocates for preventive conservation and collections care in many locations in the UK, Australia, and the locations in the US and Canada that you see on the screen. A few weeks ago, I sent out, through some different conservation discussion lists, a request for people to add their names, titles, and institutions of employment to a spreadsheet if their work was primarily in the field of preventive conservation. As of 10 a.m. on July 10th, we had 143 people on the list. I know now that there are people who identify as preventive conservators in 30 countries on 6 continents. I also know that there are 54 institutions and 9 private practices in the US and Canada that employ people whose primary responsibility is preventive conservation. And I know that this list is not yet complete. Right now, this is a visual of the states in the US where we know we have at least one preventive conservation specialist applying their knowledge to preserve collections. Imagine the good we could do for the planet, people, and profit, for museums and their missions, and for art and historic artifact collections, if we could make sustainable preventive conservation expertise available to all 33,000 of those museums I mentioned earlier. And with that, I hope that those of you who knew nothing about preventive conservation 45 minutes ago feel like you know at least the basics. I hope those of you who already knew a lot know at least a couple new things. And most importantly, I hope that you agree that a proactive, holistic, and sustainable practice of preventive conservation is a great way to preserve collections in an uncertain future. Thank you.
Too long, but while we're waiting for somebody in the audience to come up with a question, I have one from online, from Audrey Stropel, who asks, Dr. Wickens, would you be able to speak to the similarities and differences between preservation and preventive conservation? I've seen those words used interchangeably and want to know which is more correct.
Well, I guess I think they're both correct. And we do often use them interchangeably. Although I guess I think of preservation as an even larger umbrella term than preventive conservation. And so preservation will involve properties and tangible objects and intangible objects and all of the different ways that people around the world come to the care and preservation of knowledge. And preventive conservation is a little bit more specific.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. That was wonderful. Following up on that, can you also speak about the differences or similarities between collections care and preventive conservation? I've often heard that many museums have collections care departments, and wondered, how that compares to preventive.
So collections care versus preventive conservation, again, two terms that are often used interchangeably. Collections care might also include more work that's done by our registration departments in museums, so thinking about the catalog records that we're keeping, thinking about the insurance issues that we have to worry about when we're shipping things across the country or around the world, as opposed to preventive conservation, which is generally more specifically thinking about the environment in which we're keeping those things.
Any other in-person questions? Nope.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. Sure. Not to get too nerdy, but what is your view on the BIZO Green Protocol?
What is my view on the BIZO protocol? Okay, so for those of you who don't know what the BIZO protocol is, there's a group of museum directors who, I think it was 2011, might be 2014, called for a broadening of our the conditions in which we maintain in museums, asking for museums to maintain relative humidities between 40 and 60% relative humidity instead of a very, very tight parameter around 50% RH, right? And the call, the request was made, one, to help museums use less energy, but also to support the loaning of objects from one institution to another institution around the world. And I am in support of the BIZO protocol. I think there's a lot of research going on to help museums understand that we're not, and help people understand that we're not going to damage everything if we broaden our parameters. I come from a historic house museum that has never been able to maintain 50% RH, and we have a collection that is full of things that are in really good condition. I think we need to do it. Every institution needs to look at their building, they need to look at their collection, they need to consider what's vulnerable and what's less vulnerable, and make choices about where we might need to continue to maintain tight environments and where we can really relax the parameters. But I think that the focus, if you dig into the focus on why we were so centered on this 50% relative humidity, 70-degree temperature, a lot of it had to do with what HVAC systems could do. And it's much easier to have one single target when you're managing an HVAC system. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, I think I'm going to make this the last question really quickly. What is a common place that you think most institutions could start if they want to be more sustainable in their preventive conservation?
Well, I have a colleague who would say, stop using foam. Or try and recycle foam as much as you can. Try and do what Paul is doing, and take it. Don't throw those pieces away. If you've pulled something out, reuse it, because I guess the production of foam is incredibly climate unfriendly.
Thank you. So can we give Joelle another round of applause? I also just wanted to say a few thank yous. And as a former student of Joelle's, I would also like to say personally what a pleasure and honor really it is to have you here to share your work and your perspectives on this important and ever-growing and changing part of our field. There are many other conservators in the audience who have also benefited from Joelle's depth of knowledge, mentorship, as well as her boundless kindness and compassion. So thank you so much for being here. As I think you all have learned today, preventive conservation is by nature a collective undertaking and is too large for any one person to take on. So it's no surprise that it also takes a large group to put on a lecture about it. So first to Richard Rand, thank you so much for your initial and continuing support of this initiative. To the fabulous public programs team, especially Greg Sandoval, but also Daniela Alvarez, Danielle Espino, and our AV team, Vaughn and Preston. Thank you all so much for making today happen, coordinating all the logistics and offering truly invaluable support along the way. I would like to give a special shout out to my co-organizer, Sarah Freeman, for this event, as well as the conservation department heads and the rest of the museum conservation staff who have made such effort to make this lecture a priority. And to our colleagues across the museum, including curators, preparators, registrars, administrators, exhibition designers, coordinators, facilities people, and security staff. For their unwavering support in our efforts for preventive conservation and their enthusiasm as co-caretakers of this collection. And thank you all for your time and attention. We really hope you enjoy this presentation. And please do join us. We're hoping to have a few more of these in the next year or so. So thank you so much.